digitizing them. And basically, the idea of this kind of fuzzy VHS collage of everything and anything that ever appeared on the continuous flow of television from Marion's taping period of 1979 to her death in 2012, that really appealed to me as a filmmaker. And so I made contact with Marion's son, Michael, and I went to go visit him. And when I arrived at his apartment where his mother, Marion, had lived, I was taken aback by what was the fanciest apartment building in the entire Rittenhouse Square neighborhood. And when I went upstairs, they were boxing up hundreds of Macintosh computers. So all of that was a surprise. And I went across the street with Marion's son, Michael, and her personal secretary, Frank. So I had no idea that she was extraordinarily wealthy. I had no idea that she at one point had been a radical communist, or that she had become a prolific investor in Apple Computer, which largely funded her recording project. And when I went across the street to have lunch, Michael and Frank, her secretary, started to cry. And it became clear that this was a very emotionally intense family story, as well as a story of the monumental and unprecedented archive. So I aimed to make a film that kind of combined and interwove both those things. And what I learned about Marion as a figure was really singular and fascinating. She, was born in Philadelphia, put up for an adoption in Germantown. And she worked as a librarian, but in an early marriage in which she had her only son, Michael, she attempted to defect to Cuba. She was involved with the Communist Party and was becoming more and more kind of groomed to be the leader in the party. She did not defect to Cuba. She, in fact, stayed in Philadelphia, and as a single mother, got a job kind of by chance at an organization called Wellsprings that was founded by someone named John Stokes. He was somebody who was a kind of devout Catholic who was part of the ecumenical movement and was very interested in facilitating intercultural, conversations around race and class and other pressing issues of the late 1960s. Those took the form of consciousness raising sessions, and Marion sort of worked clerically at the organization. But as time went on, they had the opportunity to host a local public affairs television show called Input. And it's in Input where Marion and John Stokes, the founder, really began a close collaboration and eventually a romance, and they would become life partners. But the format of that show was very much a consciousness raising session that had all sorts of interesting people, whether it was Black Power activists or, astrologers or secretaries or, civic leaders and various activists. It really was an interesting mix of people from different walks of life, different approaches to making an imprint on the world and having meaningful conversations. And I think really captured the spirit of public media that endures today in an early period. And, that television show was one of the few things that I had that really showed Marion in depth in her own voice. After she finished making Input with John, they got married and they lived a fairly cloistered life. John came from a wealthy family, Marion did not. And in time, she became a savvy kind of autodidactic stock market investor. So from being a radical communist, she became a capitalist, and she became transfixed by Steve Jobs and I think the message and ethos of Apple Computer, particularly the idea of democratizing technology, giving the means to people to make their own media. I think a big focus and preoccupation for Marion was getting people good and solid information so they could make informed civic decisions about public life. And that she was involved in Input very much to facilitate and to espouse those values. And it was there that she began, I think, to forge a kind of critical analysis of the media was changing in the late 1970s when, as you see in the clip that was shown, Marion began her life's work, which was recording and creating a comprehensive archive of the media. It was, I think, an intuitive project at first, spawned by curiosity over the Iranian hostage crisis. But I think quickly Marion recognized that with the birth of CNN in 1980 and the 24-hour news cycle, that we were in a moment of paradigmatic shifts in which the media was going to shape public opinion in unprecedented ways, and that through this kind of onslaught of information told through the predilection of the producers of the news, that people's access to valuable information was going to become more and more complex. So, like many archivists, rather than editorializing the news or advocating as an activist, Marion's gesture and impulse was to save it. To create something comprehensive so that other people could use it as a tool to seek, in her words, good or solid information to make choices. So she pursued this project for decades at great personal cost. She became alienated from her only son and estranged from her husband's children. And her and her husband, John, went more and more kind of into isolation. So this was a project that was noble in its pursuits. I think that was activist in its orientation, and that was maddening. Some might say there was a kind of pathological dimension to what Marion was doing. But I chose in my film not to try to be an armchair psychoanalyst about it, not to kind of resort to kind of dismissing Marion's project as hoarding, but to recognize the mission behind what she was doing, and then to, on my own, to try to seek out the value in it, to try to understand what this archive can do and what is so meaningful about it. And that's what I try to do in my film. But throughout the film, because Marion's commentary on her local television program Input was my primary source, I was able to get more and more clues about her worldview and her point of view. And so her voice from this public affairs show filters throughout the film. And in the end, the Internet Archive acquired Marion's collection, and they have the intention to digitize and make that collection accessible so that people could search it online. That hasn't been completed yet, but that is the intention on their part. So in many ways, Marion's wish is being fulfilled in that kind of acquisition. But I think, this is really a story that is about public media, and about, how often the media, the commercial media that's produced kind of, falls into the trash can of history. And that Marion had the foresight and the intuition to capture and to save that, because network news stations did not. And what we have from her own kind of production of public media are clues and insights into what motivated her to pursue such an unusual and novel project. And I hope that more people like myself will have the opportunity to access her archive and to explore other forms of knowledge and information to help other people make choices about how they engage in the world. So I think that's hopefully some background that gives context to this conversation and the kind of unusual personality who has inspired it.
Great. Thank you, Matt. So you want me to take it, Bridget? You good? Okay. All right. I didn't want to step on your toes. So first of all, I just want to thank you, Matt, for that. It's just such a great film. And let me pin myself here. And I really appreciate it. I'm glad that we had an opportunity to screen it at PhillyCAM. It was very, very symbolic in many ways that we got to watch that story in that space, as I told the folks. So I think that I believe that Mrs. Stokes would have been very proud of what PhillyCAM is actually, what it represents, its space, and what people have been able to do inside that space, as a community center, and everything that it represents. So so this is really great. It's really an honor for me to be here, and we can just like thread some connections. I'm really excited about that. So Yes, I thank you for putting that link up there. I'm Antoine Haywood, as Brittany said in the beginning, and I am a fifth year PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania at the Annenberg School for Communication. And for quite some time, I just had the just a wonderful experience of working and doing community engagement for People TV in Atlanta, where I'm actually going tomorrow, and PhillyCAM. So I'm actually, what I just wanted to share tonight. I was just doing a couple of reflections actually in response to the film to do my best to kind of to highlight some threads here, things that I see in terms of connecting points between Mrs. Stokes, her story and community media, Matt. And I'm going to share my screen here in a second because I want to point people's attention to some archives that are online, that are community media archives that are very valuable resources. And Matt had mentioned the term like public media, and some people, we have the term of community media, which is on the title of this discussion. And I just also want to be clear of so what I study and what I'm referring to is a type of community media that is associated and it's supported by its affiliation with public education and government access channel infrastructure and cable. The one thing that really struck me with Mrs. Stokes' story timeline is that first of all, she represents there's so many values that are articulated in the narrative that I want to call attention to, that resonate with values that we find in a place like PhillyCAM, where I used to work, and where I'm currently a member and doing my research. And a couple of those values, and there may be some more, but these are ones that I picked up that I wanted to just call attention to. One, of course, is like this power of access. Two is knowledge production, so the value of like literacy, education, community participation and deliberative democratic communication. And then also like this taking care of place-based local narratives, so those are four things that resonate with me, and we could, open it up. But these are, when we talk about the value of like what a facility, a place like a PhillyCAM does. And it's those things, and I think one thing that struck me at the top of the film is Miss Stokes had talked about, wanting to have, access, the power of access to information, and that, people should have access, to knowledge to make good decisions. And this other line quote that just really, really resonated with me is that when she said the reason why is like, it's because it's to make choices to enhance her freedom. And that line really sticks with me because that's something that I see that is present in a lot of members who were motivated to come to a place like a PhillyCAM and to put on talk shows that resemble like Input. It's really, really cool to see, so back in the late 1960s, at the time when Input was being made here in Philadelphia, the city was just getting wired by cable. Its first ordinance for cable franchise was 1966. And by 1983, Philadelphia was supposed to get a public access television system, but that did not happen. So it's really, it's good to see that there was something at least there that enabled people to have those kinds of discourse on TV. And and again, I keep reminding myself and remind other people too. It's like this was happening at a time when there's no, like, the internet as we know it, right, does not exist. So to be able to get on television and debate these ideas and to share and do the conscious raising was a very, very big deal. And it still is today, I argue, so that is one thing that I want to highlight. The other, I'm going to share my screen real quick and call attention to some other important people. I actually pulled this slide. I know other people got some slides. So I pulled this slide. This comes from my dissertation proposal. And so for people who don't know, because I know we have people chiming in from all over, I just wanted to show what PhillyCAM looks like. It is on the corner of Ranstead, 699 Ranstead Street, in Center City, Philadelphia. So 7th and Ranstead. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of key people who were who were involved in the fight to get PhillyCAM. It was, there was supposed to be a public access corporation established in 1983. It did not happen. One of the key people who were involved in this, and I do a lot of archival work at Temple. Thank you, John Pettit and the Temple Archives. And one valuable resource that's in the Temple Archives is John C. Anderson's paper. And John C. Anderson was somebody who, when I moved to Philadelphia, I came on board at PhillyCAM, I would hear Gretchen mention John's name. I also remember her like mentioning someone else's name, Maddie Stokes, right? These are two influential African Americans who were involved in. So John C. Anderson was known as the champion, pretty much, who advocated for there to be this the ordinance that took place in 1983 to actually establish a public access corporation. So that he championed that before he passed away in October 1983. Maddie Stokes was in the community, and then there's a lot of other people too that were involved in coalitions. There were generations and generations of coalitions to make this thing to get this to this point to what we had at PhillyCAM in 2009. But I call out, so in this, I'm doing research on John C. Anderson's papers at Temple. I'm also doing research on Maddie Humphreys and the organizations that she was involved in. And lo and behold, I actually, and I'm going to switch over to something else if I can, I found that there's an actual connection between Marion Stokes and Maddie Humphreys. And how do I stop share? Oh, I don't want to go to, oh, I don't see it. I'll stop sharing real quick. So the thing is, while I get my other screen up, Maddie Humphreys was on input with Marion Stokes. And so there's this connection here between this movement, and that's why I said, I was like, I would have believed, they if they had public access back then, those two and many other people in Philadelphia would have been on there. So I'm trying to get the screen. If you go onto the community media, or actually to the archive, to the input, so there's two shows in particular, there's three shows where you can actually see Maddie Humphreys. And so, and Maddie Humphreys did testimonials. She testified in favor of getting public access all the way up to her death in 2001. And I believe there's a documentary being produced right now on her life. So other things, I am stuck in my slides. Oh, here we go. So the other things that I want to share too is just before I wrap is, we see this parallel between the development of the technology and what it allows Marion to do, and also how people start to gain more and more access, and then you've seen that, it also allows, that proliferated throughout community media centers throughout the country, that are tied to, that had public access channels, and people were able to get more access to cameras and be able to document, to what's happening in culture in their neck of the woods. And I think, one of the things that is very important, and I'm thinking about other people who are very influential in the movement for public access television nationally, is Dee Helyx, who's co-founder of Paper Tiger Television, Deep Dish TV, just a pioneer in the work that we do. And one of the things that Dee shared with me, and I had a conversation with her back in 2019 when she came into Philadelphia, is to also consider how what is done at a place like PhillyCAM, and we know that there's 1,600 entities that operate 3,000 PEG channels throughout the country right now, and unfortunately, not all of these places have immaculate archives. Of which they did, but in places that they do, it's a very rich collection of really hyper local culture and place-based narratives. And so, and Dee, she reminded me of that. And so that's one thing too that I want to just flag with people. I know PhillyCAM has internal storage, and Khalila is going to be talking about a project here that we're working on in terms of the archiving of narratives produced through community media. So with that, I just want to flip here to show you all real quick so you can see it, and then I will be done. This is what, so if you go to the Internet Archive, here's another tie between, Marion Stokes. So input is on the Internet Archive, as well as there's the Community Media Archive. And this is this is an aggregator. And so so programs are being pulled from community media television operations throughout across the country on here. There's also an app called Cablecast, where people can watch the live streams. But this, I just, wanted to show people that. And then there's also there's an archive of the Community Media Review. So for people who want to dig into, do some crate digging on the history of community television in the US, all of that stuff is here. I spent a lot of time in here, for my research, pretty much in researching the movement. And then, like I said, in local archives, like at temples, special collections, I spent a lot of time there as well, researching, and the city archives, researching the history of cable. So, but yeah, it is very fascinating to see the intersections of people who are activists locally, people who are storytellers, people who are, who are entrepreneurs, or enterprisers, how they all come to these spaces. The last thing that I want to say, and I'll pass it on to, who's that? Tahid is next. Tahid next? No, not okay. Well, Leela's next. Oh, perfect. Yeah. So I just shouted out Leela. And I think that this is a great quote it's a nice setup for Leela. And at the end of the end of Recorder, the film, I believe it was Thomas Levin who said this, the quote of like all archives create futures. And that really resonated with me as well. And there was this I love there's this kind of this allusion to like Marion as a futurist, through the archive. Like that's like blowing my mind, right? So someone being, even if you want to go as far as saying an Afrofuturist through the archive, we can even go there. I don't write about that kind of stuff, but like, that is really, with her love with Star Trek and, and what that value of going, understanding what these narratives are past, how that helps guides us forward. So I really appreciate that. With that said, I'm gonna stop and pass it on to Khalila, and welcome any questions that people have just about community media and what participatory media making looks like here in Philadelphia, what I'm studying or what I've seen in other places. All right, thank you all. Khalila.
Hi, Antoine. Thanks for the shout out. Yeah, awesome presentation. I want to also thank Brittany, the Laurel Hill Cemetery, and PhillyCAM for the opportunity of sharing some of the work that we're doing here at People's Media Records. Let me share a screen.
How do I take that? I gotta take my pen off.
Oh, okay.
I think. Oh, there it is. It says pen. There we go.
Yeah. Is mine working? Yeah.
Yeah, you good.
Okay, good. Well, thanks again, Antoine. And so yeah, actually, it's funny that you mentioned that quote from Tom Levine, because I also sort of thought it as a very poignant quote that we can think about in terms of the importance of archiving community media and just in general, not only in Philly. So yeah, my name is Khalila Chaar-Pérez. My pronouns are she and they, and and I'm the digital archivist at the People's Media Records. So first I want to give you all a brief history of what People's Media Record is, or PMR as we also call it. And the People's Media Record began in 2017 as the official repository for the media created by what was called then the Media Mobilizing Project, or MMP, lots of acronyms here. And it continues to serve as an archive for these materials. And so MMP was founded almost 20 years ago in 2005 by a small group of activists experimenting with the use of video and narrative to support and strengthen community movements in Philly. And so their work responded to the need for independent media or community media especially to share the untold stories of primarily poor and working people of color, communities that have, of course, been historically excluded and continue to be excluded from the process of creating and distributing media. MMP's community journalists broke, covered, and developed stories long before and after they hit mainstream news, connecting the local with the national and also global, from the Dreamers to Occupy Philly to the movement for Black Lives. So the thousands of hours that make up the MMP collection tell the unique story of the growing struggle for racial and economic justice in Philly. And if we see it like in the context of Marion Stokes' mission of resisting what she called, there's a phrase in one of the conversations that she's having, like in input, what she called the manipulation of minds and emotions. MMP sought to be an instrument for liberation from the status quo and its narrative. So in 2020, MMP rebranded itself as MAP, or the Movement Alliance Project, continuing the mission of community building and supporting movement infrastructures. In 2021, MAP received funding from the Mellon Foundation for the expansion of PMR, which has become one of MAP's sponsored projects. A central part of that expansion was to explore how to best support and collaborate with other local community media collections facing the challenges of preservation. And this led to a project, the development of the Philadelphia Audiovisual Collections Evaluation, or PACE, a needs assessment of the state of archiving and preservation of local community media collections in Philly. Since spring of last year, a small group of representatives from Scribe Video Center, PhillyCAM, and PMR have been meeting to craft and conduct this assessment. PACE included a detailed survey of 20 respondents, and we also had 6 in-depth interviews with representative collections and 4 focus groups. As an example of the MMP collection, I would like to just show you like a 1-minute clip from one of MMP's videos documenting the struggle against the building of Foxwoods Casino in Chinatown 14 years ago in 2009.
Is anyone getting audio?
Here at the grand opening of the No Slack Spot, which is an empty casino organizing space. Our elected officials are really trying to pass this off as some innocent form of entertainment. And what we're saying is that innocent entertainment doesn't depend on creating addiction for its business plan. And so we're saying that this is a really corrosive business to put right at the heart of our city.
I can now on the many roads of casino development here in the heart of our city. We promise.
So in that video you could see like some of the participatory work that community journalists from MAP were doing, from MMP, sorry. Sometimes the acronyms get all mixed. Back in 2009, actually echoing, think of the Save Chinatown work that's being done right now against the building of against the, hopefully not happening building of the stadium in the area. It kind of gets stuck a little. So I want to step back now and explain a little like a concept I've been using to describe the collections we assessed, and that is community media collections. It overlaps with what Antoine was saying, but it also kind of goes beyond it. So as we used it, community media collections means the documentation and gathering outside an institutional archive of media produced in service of the community, who also creates this media. And so this could, this includes a place like PhillyCAM, which is archiving its own, all the material that's being produced like by media makers through PhillyCAM, but also it can like include anything that is directly related to community, but maybe it's not housed like in an organization like PhillyCAM or a community access media station. And in terms of like our study, media included many things, but the main focus of our assessment was time-based materials, so audio and video. And so looking at the documentary about Marion Stokes, can it help us think about the differences also between the material that Stokes was preserving, mainstream media, versus the media that we're centering on at PMR, which is community media. So I just want to go over now some of the key takeaways of this assessment in terms of types of media, the top formats of the collection we surveyed were physical documents, and that included flyers, records, etc., VHS, digitized media, print photographs, and also mini DV tapes, which are really important because so many of the tape formats are not made to last more than 20 years, and especially mini DV. So there is like a really urgent need to digitize like these tapes that a lot of media makers out there were using like in the 1990s, 2000s, and even onward to produce their work. So the most evident issue for all the collections in general that we evaluated was capacity. The lack of time, the lack of staff, the lack of resources were continually cited as the main barriers to preservation and digitization practices. And this has an understandable impact on long-term preservation planning and documentation. So for instance, only 9 out of 20 respondents indicated in the study that there was long-term planning for their collection, while only 1 respondent stated that their organization had a written preservation plan for preservation. Now I want to highlight the urgent need for infrastructure support. As the graph here shows, most of the surveyed collections haven't been digitized. And participants stress that digitization takes a big toll on organizations. Again, the issue of capacity. And in addition, digitizing materials also means having to expand storage capacity to make space for new records. So that also adds to like, the issue of resources. So seeing the capacity limitations that people are facing, it's not surprising that community media collections expressed a deep need to connect to infrastructures that can provide support for preservation practices in general. This support can vary. It can range from storage assistance from archives like the People's Media Record or stewardship through a university special collections department. We can think of temples, special collections. Another possibility could be the sharing of structures through the developing of a network of collections where archivists and media makers from different organizations can collaborate together. It's also important to keep in mind that the needs of each collection are different and frequently unique. Some have more resources and larger collections than others, for example. So this means that one cannot always generalize about the state of these collections and that they demand an approach that understands them in their own specific context. In terms of training and expertise, only 6 out of 20 survey respondents answered yes to having staff with some knowledge or training and preservation. In general, participants said there was a high need for expanding skills and knowledge in most preservation areas. And when they were discussing their expertise, participants often described themselves as amateurs, some even after 20+ years of archival experience. The fear or anxiety around being an amateur, which a lot of us have experienced, could be increased by structural issues such as limited capacity and how archival work has been professionalized. Instead of formal training, participants reported turning to word-of-mouth channels, online research, and also practice. Should be noted that professional archivists often have to learn in these ways due to the ever-changing nature of digital technology. Now, although these individuals may describe themselves as amateurs, as caretakers of these collections, they're often the most reliable stewards of their community stories. The trust and autonomy that community media collections offer to marginalized communities serves as a form of empowerment against the whitewashing and exclusions that can occur in traditional archives. These informal practices and the individuals that cultivate them are invaluable resources for their community. And that leads me to the end of our story, which is that this year, PMR is working on a public report to share with the general public and the collections we assessed, to be released in spring. And based on analysis of our findings, this report will propose a series of opportunities for community media collections to develop stronger preservation practices and to grow as community. We also plan to discuss the report with participants and other relevant people as part of our goal to build community around these practices. And with these goals in mind, we'll be holding a series of workshops in the summer, focusing on the needs that were most evident in the assessment, from preservation planning, digitization, and cataloging and metadata, to copyright and licensing, and how to securely preserve your mobile media. And we're really excited about these workshops, and we'll be hopefully making an announcement of the series later in spring. So if you're interested, please contact us. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation and questions and later today.
Thank you, Khalila. Awesome. So we have two more speakers up, and then we'll open this up for a dialogue towards the end. So we had up next is, I gotta get my list right because I messed it up last time.
It's me.
Right. It's not John.
It's John.
That's right. Yes. John, deep from the tape archives,
Here
which I
we
admired that. And then we have Tahid Chappelle. John, actually, that at one point when I worked at People TV, that's what our looked like in the back, because we had all tapes. So, you froze.
So, yeah. So, I'm actually I'm amazed at how well it's worked at presenting me as in my element, usually in my day-to-day, either in our offsite storage facility, which houses all of this material, or in our conservation lab in the basement of our newish library at Temple, Charles Library. And so let me get my slides up here. So my name is John Pettit, and I work as Assistant Archivist at Special Collections Research Center, Temple University Libraries. And for anyone who is not familiar with Special Collections Research Center, it was founded in 1967 as sort of, is intended to be sort of a more ground level, kind of history, less top down. A lot of Philadelphia, history was dedicated to sort of, colonial era, and sort of, there wasn't really much of a scene for people who were collecting, 20th century material. And so it started with, a lot of organizational records, and then kind of grew to include, kind of some more cultural products, newspapers, and, some point around the early 80s started taking on audiovisual material, but as you'll hear, it's not something that, we started working with until about like 11 or so years ago. So let me share this here. Get into Zoom. And so, yes, so it's Philadelphia news footage in the archives. And so there's kind of a lot of intertwined histories going on here. There's, sort of, my personal history in working with this material. There is the, sort of history of media production and as this news footage develops. And then, there's this evolution in, how this stuff is used, and sort of talked about. And so, I'm going to kind of jump around between these couple different disparate threads and, hopefully give you a little bit of history, more broadly on news collections, and, kind of what they look like, who uses them, and kind of what the narrative is there, using the news collections here at Temple as, the sort of talk about the larger landscape. So it's funny, we're sort of like, the inverse of a little bit, of what Marion was doing. Marion was documenting, capturing this mainstream media from, sort of an outsider perspective, and we're kind of seeing things as they're broadcast, as people are digesting it and capturing it. Archives traditionally, we have collections that are supposed to reflect, the functioning of the creator, kind of what the intent was, kind of all little, pieces, how things are arranged, to kind of produce, this sort of ultimate body, that winds up in the archives. Most of our stuff's around 3 collections. The 3 major collections, of audiovisual material, none of which are sort of community media, but what I'll talk about later, oftentimes can complement, community media or become a piece that there's dialogue around. So most of my slides are just so you don't have to look at me. I love this one here of the, KYW production area. So, news footage started off, media production was in very few hands. It very much was something that, was not hyper local, in its production. And it's not until about the late 40s, post World War II, that you get this move, to, creating local news. And it wasn't until decades after there was sort of a reckoning in like, what is this stuff? What do we do with it? How do we hang on to it? And what kind of value does it even have? It began as an extension of other forms of journalism like print and radio, with this added illustrative element. this, explaining, the collections here at Temple, although it's somewhat unique, it's, as I go to these conferences, as you talk to people, as you do readings, it's, is a pretty common, there's a good set of commonalities, in how this stuff travels, how it's preserved and how it's used. There's nationally always been a little bit more of a scene to preserve things. There's obviously been huge gaps, but the major networks sort of did have some foresight into forethought into preserving this material. And then locally, when you get into the each local affiliate, it becomes incredibly scattershot. This stuff that comes to us often comes in this sort of information vacuum. Oftentimes it's just the tapes, the film canisters themselves, and, kind of not much more beyond that you have to work with. So here's 16 millimeter. This is 16 millimeter is, kind of the real, workhorse of news, and specifically local news footage, from the late 40s through, in many cases, the early 80s. And this is a good example of what I face day to day. This is, a reel from January 18th, 1967. For the stories that the news shot, they clipped off and just kind of threw in these cans. And in many cases, I don't know that any of this stuff was ever viewed at all. Sometimes they're just the outs. They would, take off, 5 or 6 seconds, for the broadcast. And then, the rest just kind of went in here. And, here's a sampling of some of the stories. Foglietta, local politician. The other one says bank holdup, housing discrimination, Delaware River Report. And then you always have to have the, totally illegible. Does anyone have a guess on that C word? There's, I've gotten to know the personalities of, handwriting of all of the people that work there. Some eras are kind of better than others. So there was 16 that was produced, and 16, the good thing about 16 is it was sort of its own best advocate for its preservation, in that you could not record over 16 millimeter film. So unless there was somebody, actively grabbing this stuff and tossing it, which of course, did happen, this stuff, kind of just sat around. In many cases, it's, what pulled through. Ironically, film is kind of more stable of a medium, than a lot of forms of video that came later. I've rarely had problems with film that I've had with, video that, is from like the 80s or even 90s, in some cases, depending on, what stock was used. So yeah, informational vacuum. This is stuff that just sort of came. We don't have the paper records. It's the footage, it's here, and it kind of is what it is. You can sort of infer intent by, what the camera person was shooting, how things were edited, but there isn't, kind of a lot of backstory on, on production there. And, a great cross of, there's a lot said about, news media and, all of its, incredibly problematic, ways of talking about news, ways of influencing people's minds. But, there's, informational and evidential value, to the news footage itself. It's just, a lot of times it's, especially early on, it was sort of the only game in town. So you move along in time, and you get a big, kind of a big switch. in the mid-70s, there's a shift from using the 16 millimeter to electronic news gathering to the use of video. And, video was a godsend to a lot of producers because it was cheap. It's a real game changer. And, you can, I think in most of these collections, when you go, you can see in the 70s, there's a bit of a black hole. There's a period where, either, the tape stock, it was just, kind of not really well developed or formulated. There's a producer who just went, kind of nuts taping over things. And the news switches from being, the earlier stuff, you're getting the trims, the outs, you're getting all this perspective on how this stuff is produced. And then when you get into things being recorded onto video, you have, just kind of, air checks, things as they appeared on the network. As I said, we don't have much paper records, but I come across things here and there, that sort of give me some perspective on what was going on in the network. Here's a whole thing about dubbing the show on 2-inch, complete, things need to be bulk erased before you dub. I was just going to joke, this is my tissue dispenser, although it looks like a video cleaner, for all of the times that I'm seeing this stuff that was wiped from video across time. Yeah, don't have a ton of time left, so could talk a little bit more about some of the collections we have. The Philadelphia Special Investigation Commission is another huge resource. It's everything pertaining to the 1985 move bombing. And again, it's one of these things that is used. People come at it from lots of different angles. There's a lot to be said about the way the news covered this, and a lot of people are able to take these pieces and go off and have that be part of dialogue. We're used by the general public. There are commercial researchers using our material. There are people that are coming in, students as part of National History Day projects, community media projects like Scribes, Precious Places. Recently I went to a Precious Places screening, and they were using all sorts of our footage as part of, as part of the community media being produced. So there's all sorts of ways that this stuff gets kind of Easter egg into kind of other forms of media and other dialogues. So there's a lot more that we could probably talk about in the discussion, but I will just turn it over for now. But thanks a lot.
Thanks, John. One of the things I put in the chat real quick is I've learned in the archives it's really fun to find a date and then look at what did the Germantown Courier cover on that day? What did the Inquirer cover?
Sorry, I lost sound here.
So, there he is. Yeah. So thank you for that. Super fun stuff. Next we have Tahid. You gotta, I think, unpin here. Right?
How's this work?
There you go. All right. Tahid, you're up. And then so real quick, I know, so we're at 7:47. There's a time check. I'm also just gonna ask people, if you don't mind, Tahid, if people can start queuing questions in the chat.
Oh yeah, put them in there.
Yeah. So and it's just in general. So just throw your questions in the chat. So and we'll just transition straight from you, Tahid, into just responding to questions and hearing questions. All right, thank you.
All right, so thank you everybody. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Tahid Chappelle, pronouns he, him. I've spent about 10 years in the corporate media environment, 4 years in local TV news as a social and digital producer, 4 years in the print world, 2 being at the Washington Post and 2 being at the Philadelphia Inquirer before I joined Free Press. So we've talked a lot about audio visual broadcast. I'm going to talk a little bit about newspapers, specifically the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the role of media watchdog and media accountability, something that I think is the essence of this conversation when we talk about documentation and keeping those receipts, because they are historical and they come in handy later. So this is the story of Philly John, the Journalism Accountability Watchdog Network, which was created basically last year. Has been a collective that has been making a little bit of waves in Philadelphia, and I'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing. So here's how we became JOHN, which is a media monitoring committee of sorts. So some of you might have remembered back when the pandemic had started in 2020, there was also the murder of George Floyd. There was the global uprising for Black lives. Specifically, there was just a call to support Black lives and to show that Black lives mattered. And then my former employer, the Philadelphia Inquirer, decided to run this headline called Buildings Matter Too, which basically superimposed and put real estate and buildings above the lives of Black people. And so you can only imagine that the backlash that ensued both internally at the Inquirer within its journalists of color and externally within the Philadelphia region, and I would say nationally too, definitely put the Inquirer against the ropes. And so the Inquirer, in trying to scramble on how to address this PR disaster, basically decided that it wanted to highlight and highlight and look at internally the culture, the procedures, the processes that made this type of headline come to be, but also to look at how its internal culture was not really shaping or meeting the information needs of Black and brown populations within Philadelphia. And so the Inquirer decided that it was going to become and transform itself into an anti-racist institution following this egregious headline. And so my work at Free Press, which is focusing on changing how journalists cover crime, police, and the criminal legal system, Free Press wrote a local petition that had more than 40 social, racial, and media justice organizations, as well as dozens of people sign on, calling for the Inquirer to fundamentally transform itself. We wanted them to be very public and transparent about the demographics of its newsroom, its sources, its advertisers, and its readership. Who was it actually serving as a newsroom? What was the makeup of the newsroom? And was that actually accurately reflecting the information needs of Black and brown community members? We wanted them to shift their narratives away from police and authoritative sources and center community-led, grassroots-led programs that were actually addressing root causes of gun violence and poverty. And we asked them to diversify management in all facets of the company, especially hiring people specifically from Philadelphia so they can bring that institutional knowledge of their neighborhoods, of their city as well. And we also asked them to create an external advisory board to hold them accountable in trying to transform themselves into an anti-racist institution. So those were kind of our top 3 recommendations in terms of holding them accountable. So before John was John, the affinity groups, which these journalism affinity groups, which is the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, the Philadelphia chapter, and the Asian American Journalism Association, Philadelphia chapter, came together to write this this joint letter to the Philadelphia Inquirer leadership, basically reiterating that they wanted them to transform as an institution and that they have to address and acknowledge their racism historically, but also be transparent on how they're going to remedy the hurt and the harm that they caused following the Buildings Matter 2 headline. And this was a call to action to bring leaders to the Inquirer, or from the Inquirer to the table, to hear from them how they're going to be held accountable and what types of demands they need to meet. And then within this time period during the pandemic, Temple University was hired from the Inquirer to do this very deep and thorough diversity and inclusion audit, which can be linked in the chat and emailed out later. I highly recommend you read it. What one of their conclusions was is that, not surprisingly, the newsroom itself was predominantly white, covering a community that's predominantly Black, and most of the newsroom staff were white. They came from white communities and they didn't have a connection to these diverse populations. Following the audit, this groundbreaking audit that kind of analyzed the content, the production, the diversity of the Inquirer, again, the journalism affinity groups that are all fighting for diversity, equity, and inclusion within the media market in Philadelphia came together again to write a joint statement saying that they weren't surprised by the findings, but they wanted to underline the necessity of diversifying the journalists within the newsroom, meeting the demands of the journalists of color, and also, again, meeting the demands of the public so that they can be transparent on addressing their media harm stemming from the Buildings Matter 2 headline. So it's been about 2 years. In June of this year, it'll be about 3 years since this headline dropped. What has the Inquirer done since the controversy? So they did create a More Perfect Union project, which was a long-form, multi-part project that not only analyzed the Inquirer's kind of racist historical roots, but it also looked at the birth of the crime coverage of TV stations and how the "if it bleeds, it leads" was really created in Philadelphia thanks to the combination of both newspaper coverage of crime and TV coverage of crime as well. They also issued an apology right after the creation of their More Perfect Union project. They created a communities and engagement desk, which was supposed to be a way for communities to interface with Inquirer journalists. That really hasn't happened. They hired a new vice president of DEI, and then they also publicly, again, declared that they wanted to be an anti-racist institution. And I just wanted to highlight here on the left side, as we're talking about broadcast, the Inquirer in their More Perfect Union project, they did have an investigation focusing on TV reporting and how that has influenced and impacted its viewers, specifically in Philadelphia. So I highly recommend you actually read a More Perfect Union, especially the first 2 parts that look at the Inquirer and the local broadcast TV stations here in Philadelphia. What haven't they done, though? They haven't really been public about their ongoing DEI efforts. You'll hear in about a minute or so that they actually have not been transparent about what they've been doing to address the lack of journalists of color and lack of managers of color within their newsroom. They haven't created an outside community advisory group, despite the fact that Free Press and the Temple University audit recommended that an outside advisory group made up of different community groups and community members be created. They still haven't made that. They haven't retained journalists of color, particularly Black journalists. They've lost a lot of Black journalists over the last couple of years. They've not diversified management. They have not publicized their internal policies that would make them an anti-racist institution. Again, they came out and said they wanted to be an anti-racist institution. What does that mean? And they have not addressed former journalists of color's concerns or acknowledged different diversity audits that have happened within the Inquirer, both in 2004 and in 2017. So last year, it came to a head that outside of the sports section within the Philadelphia Inquirer's newsroom, there were 0 Black male news reporters. The last Black male news reporter outside of sports left the Inquirer to join this news organization called The Trace, which focuses on gun violence. The newsroom had no Black male reporters outside of sports. And this is a newsroom, a 100-year-old institution that is literally covering a predominantly Black city, not actually having any representation within his newsroom to tell our stories with accuracy and nuance and context. And so the affinity groups, along with Free Press, we wrote a joint letter together calling ourselves the Journalism Accountability Watchdog Network. We had been seeing over the years, especially during the uprisings and the pandemic, that a lot of media institutions in Philadelphia were not really meeting the needs of Black and Brown community members. They weren't making Black and Brown viewers and news consumers civically engaged. They were not talking about the root causes of gun violence and poverty. They were not accurately hiring people within Philadelphia to bring in their institutional knowledge to really change the way the news was being broadcast. And so we had enough of it. We were fed up. And so we wrote a joint letter, again, asking for the Inquirer leadership to meet us at the table and talking about how are they going to address their DEI issues, because their content was showing that their lack of diversity was not reaching the audiences that they said that they wanted to reach. And so the intent of John of this accountability watchdog network is to basically be the watching, we're watching the watchdog. We want to hold newsrooms accountable for harmful coverage, toxic newsroom practices, and excluding communities in their news gathering process. We want to talk about looking at and defining mechanisms for holding media accountability for their reporting. And we want to empower the public and let them know that you can take a part in participating in holding journalists and these institutions accountable too, that you do have a voice. And if you do see coverage that you think is harmful, biased, or puts other people in danger, that you can use your voice and call this out too. So we're really hoping to change the way that Philadelphia newsrooms engage with the communities, and these affinity groups that are focused on diversifying the media ecosystem. We're hoping to really build that platform and build that bridge to bring more people into the public, into the fold. And so do you want to, if you're inspired about holding media, especially corporate media, accountable, and you want to form your own little squad of media monitoring committee members, think about what your mission, vision, values are. Who is your community? Who are you trying to help? How do you define media harm and media accountability? And are you keeping receipts? Are you documenting the media harm, recording or saving the links that address your issues, or at least showcase the issues? And relating to all of this, in terms of archiving, representation matters. Documentation, archiving of this history is really important, because many times we've seen in our ongoing engagement with different newsrooms, both within Philly and outside of Philly, somehow newsroom leaders forget. They sometimes don't remember the production or the news stories that came out that they believe was not harmful. But having those receipts and those links is really critical in terms of building your case. We recognize that there needs to be more media education out there so people can come to their conclusions. But if there's only one side of the story being told, there's only one side of the story that's being broadcasted and shared. Speak up and speak out, and create your own media. Support places like PhillyCAM, because if our stories are not in our hands to tell, then someone else is going to tell it, and they may not tell it accurately or in a skewed position. And so in the spirit of all this, the media is the message, but people can feel empowered to hold journalists and these media institutions accountable, to make them know that we're watching and this is affecting us, and here's what you need to do better. So that's my little spiel on the Journalism Accountability Watchdog Network.
Awesome. Thank you, Tahid. That was like the perfect, just like bookend right there. It just brought that whole, just all together. So appreciate you. Yes, and then appreciate our other panelists. Matt, thank you. Khalila, thank you. John, thank you. Of course, thank you. Big shout outs and much love to our friends at Laurel Hill and PhillyCAM. I think we did have a big question. So I'm so
sorry. I actually have to run. I feel so badly. I wanted to be part of this conversation, but these presentations were so amazing. So
yeah, thank you, Matt.
Marion Stokes would have loved to have heard all of this and to hear about the amazing work that you're all doing. So I apologize that I have to leave, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks for making a film that was such a great jumping off point for all this conversation.
Yeah, really. Shout out to you, Matt. Shout out to you.
Thank you for all the work you guys are doing too.
Cool. I'm okay with staying on. I know it's 8:02, so people may fall off, but I'm cool with answering some quick questions. People want to have a quick discussion. I'm totally fine with that. So,
do we have any questions?
I think there was one question in the chat that was about there's a big one from Dr. Joe. Before that, Simon had asked about what's the contemporary equivalent of what Marion Stokes did? What would it take technologically, meant as a way to consider the extent to which the internet has changed everything about information spreads? I don't know, John, you wanna holler at that one? You got thoughts about that?
I plugged in one thing. I mean, the Vanderbilt Television News Archive is, doing something that, kind of resembles Marion's efforts, pretty directly. you know, they I mean, they were doing this work. It's of course loaded with all sorts of rights issues. I mean, I think there's even provisions in copyright law, you know, that specifically address what Vanderbilt, you know, are doing. And it is very similar to what Marion was doing. They're, you know, capturing CNN, a lot of these major news networks, you know, kind of with multiple machines going at once. And yeah, that's a close one. You know, Antoine mentioned, you know, Internet Archive. That's another great one.
I mean, I guess so to kind of maybe clarify my question, I guess first it's defining like the equivalent of what she was collecting, and there was just like there were a lot fewer sources of media, you know. It was a lot harder for most people to share information widely in general, you know. So it's kind of like, I mean, asking like what's the equivalent of, you know, of the scope of what she was doing is kind of, I mean, there isn't actually a good question to that, or a good answer to that, you know. So maybe, I'm not sure if it's, you know, maybe it wasn't a usefully phrased question, but I guess, you know, because it looks like the Vanderbilt Project is collecting mostly like kind of mainstream news sources, which is definitely useful, but it's kind of like, you know, because there's so many like YouTube, you know, like is the contemporary equivalent of what she did.
Oh, okay.
YouTube,
So yeah,
sort of
so
thing,
a contemporary equivalent that's capturing all these other
right.
sources that have
because like there's YouTube channels that, I mean, I'm not into it, but that are apparently incredibly influential politically even, you know. So you know, so I guess defining even the scope, you know, is tricky. And I guess insofar as it's a hypothetical question, like we don't need to have like an answer. It's just really a way to like think about like how much it's changed, I guess. So and yeah, like TikTok, Twitter, like, you know, I guess when we're defining the scope, are we defining by like creators, you know, like by like, you know, random individual, like, because YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, that's like for the most part individuals. It's not like even collectives or, you know, small groups for the most part. So
yeah, but the platforms they're on, you know, are bad, you know. They're really tough. I mean, they're all these notoriously, you know, all these, Facebook's not going to let you under the hood, you know, if you're an archivist. TikTok's not going to do that. And so I mean, yeah, it'll be interesting to see, you know, how that kind of thing evolves. I mean, what do they have going on in the back end? You know, anything. Is there anyone who talks about this sort of preserving this content? It's really hard to do. It's not something, you know, it's funny. It's like TV's so complicated, you know, or at least feels that way. And then you get into, you know, these like proprietary online platforms, and that's just like a whole other world that is kind of almost insurmountable, you know.
Yeah, like you need to be a programmer somehow. Like it's, you know, like, yeah, like, you know, instead of like knowing how to work, you know, VHS machine, whatever.
Not to mention, if you did it, they'd probably come after you immediately if they got
without a doubt. Yeah, lawsuits.
Yeah, and then the other thing is just there's so much that's being, you know, made every second, you know, versus back when you know, you look at it, it's like, oh, you know, I remember when I was young. So I basically, you know, Marion's like the archive that parallels my like life, like my child. Like she started recording when I was born pretty much in like 78, 79, you know. And back, I remember when I was very, very little, when Ted Koppel was on back, you know, it was like news wasn't on that much, you know, it wasn't, TV even wasn't on that much, you know. So, and then you only had like a handful of channels. And so people weren't making, you know, there's that, you know, so, but it's just, it's mind blowing to think even now, it's like what you're saying, Simon, how do you even begin? Because you have so many people, like this countless people every second that are making something that's going out there. And then it's this decision of what gets saved, you know, what's important, which it's hard to determine, like who's the arbiter.
From the archivist perspective, kind of like one of the most like key things we do is decide what is, has enduring historic value.
Right. Right.
And so, and storage space is always getting cheaper, but like when you think about the sheer volume of video that's been created, like, is there even an estimate of like how many, how much that is? Like, so.
When you get into
environmental impact too. Yeah, good point.
Right.
Because it takes electricity and, like metals. Yeah.
And just context, it's really easy for people to produce media now, but I feel like it's harder there's a different skill set that's involved with, providing that contextual information. It's like, these like little film nubs, somebody just wrote on the tape and put it on there, and there you go. It's metadata, that's the story. People aren't doing that with their, the video they're doing on their phone. I mean, there's some savvy people who are doing that. And of course, when you have, like organizations like People's Media Record, trying to, sort of, teach that like, oh yeah, this is an important part of it, aside from just maintaining the actual video, but, maintaining the information about the video. It's not an easy thing to do anymore. And I think that gets kind of tossed by the wayside too.
All right. Any other questions for our esteemed panelists? Dr. Joe Lexflower also reports a lengthy. I'm not going to read it all, but let people, if you haven't seen it, his reflections and connections there, very, very nice in the chat. But
Antoine, do you have any other questions that you wanted to pose to the speakers?
Yeah, I actually do. So I just wanted to, I had two big questions. And actually I think Simon kind of hinted to this. I wanted to just hear folks just on a really basic level, what makes an archive an archive? And I think, the average person probably doesn't think about archives on a regular basis, but, if you all could just speak just a little bit of what you think there is the cultural value and what we should keep in, what people just in general should keep in mind.
Yeah, I can speak a little about that. I think our idea of like what's an archive, it's very sort of Eurocentric and based on, sort of like the general idea that you see like circulating a lot, right? In terms of documenting and preserving materials. And I think we also need to sort of think about that and question that as we keep, doing the work that we're doing. And it's something I struggle with. And part of like when we sort of use the term collection, we were sort of like maybe trying to get away a little from archive because usually folks associate like the idea of the archive with like at least some form of like structure that might include like resources, that might include like staff, that might include all that. But then you think of your grandma who had like this incredible collection of X, Y, and Z. You think of obviously Mrs. Stokes, who had like this incredible archive that was then sort of like, retaken. And I don't know, it's a difficult question to answer. But I think it's important to think of like also like, I don't know, like then the uses, think of access, because we can preserve everything and then who the hell is engaging with it, right? Like, especially if it's, something produced by, marginalized communities. So what happens there? So that's my rambling response to you.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, in terms of like what what is archive? I mean, yeah, it's kind of funny. I always traditionally, you know, every time I start a talk off, I always ask people, you know, when's the last time, you know, they have watched some archival AV media. And I'm always like, you know, amazed. Like everyone just thinks it's a very abstract thing, you know, and they're like, you know, unless they go into the archives and look at it, you know, and it's expressly stated as that. Oh, audiovisual. Yeah, audiovisual material.
Oh no, no, I was
That
joking.
was just a question.
I'm wondering if you got blank stares.
And yeah, and it's funny, you know, I mean, it's, you know, and it's not until I start talking about all the different ways that this stuff pops up, you know, that audiovisual archival material, you know, it's like you watch it on the news, you know, the news is archival material within this broadcast, which in itself is, you know, going to become something, you know, that is part of an archive, or, you know, or there's a question around whether it should, you know, be something in an archive. Yeah. And you know, documentary films, you know, I mean, the list just goes on forever and ever. But it definitely is something that you want, you know, people's sense of what an archive is, I feel like isn't always, you know, what archival material is, doesn't always capture everything that is around them every day, every second, really.
Yeah, I don't really have a good answer to this either. You know, I my partner is a photographer, and sometimes I'm like, you're taking so many pictures. What is the meaning of all these pictures? What are you going to do with it? What's going to happen to it? And to her, it's just, for her, it's just capturing history in a moment in time. And for her, that in of itself is important to her. And so, you know, I think archives sometimes can be, what's it called? Dependent upon the person and what they value and what they find is worthy and what they think is uniquely helpful to their lives. So, yeah, I feel like it can be subjective in many ways. You know, a piece of paper that's found in a card years ago could be an archive to somebody, but could be trash to another person. And it depends on what importance do you put on it for yourself.
Thanks. Yeah, one thing I want to chime in and say real quick in the response to this, so there's some futurist discussion that's happening in the chat, which is fun. And, you know, just from my dissertation research experience, that digging in the archives, it's really neat to think of, and I had referred to you know, Mrs. Stokes as, you know, as a futurist. It's really cool to like dig into archives and look into the past, but as it like thinking of it as like a window into the future. You know, it's like that is some really fun stuff because you see these narratives. And I'd referred to the community media review, which is this like it's 50 years of you know, documentation of the community television movement in the United States, and along with the advent of cable television and mobile video technology. And I'm starting to see a lot of parallels between that movement and then what's happening in the movement with broadband and digital inclusion right now. And at some point, I'm curious, it's like, are these two things mirroring each other? And so will we see what happened with cable at some point down the line? Is that going to be the same thing with like broadband and whole digital inclusion? But it's a huge thing. But I love being able to go into the archives and have this sense of time travel. You know, Back to the Future is one of my favorite movies. And, you know, the archives to me is like the DeLorean. You know, it's like I kind of get to go in and travel through time, you know, and you can go around, and even though you're in the past, but you can kind of have a glimpse into the future. So And I used to love watching Star Trek as well, because even though they were in this quote unquote imaginary future, they would still have these period pieces and they would go back in time that would inform them something about where they were in the present and how they needed to move forward. So really, really cool meta stuff here to discuss about. All righty. Thank you all so much. Brittany, are there any other questions or anything that we needed to?
Not for me, unless you or any of the other speakers wanted to add. I feel like this conversation could just keep going.
We can get really
And
long.
it seems like we could all go real deep with Star Trek.
Yeah, we can go pretty deep, into the cinema, the sci-fi.
The one thing I'll say is just support PhillyCAM, people-powered media. When I got to Philly, I had never seen anything like PhillyCAM, and we need more PhillyCAMs. So shout out to PhillyCAM.
Yeah. And, on that note too,
Here.
just shout out to our ecosystem, just hearing from everyone talk. I mean, it's very, very unique, rich ecosystem of organizations and initiatives, partnerships that are happening here. That is, I mean, I'm so grateful for it, and for us to all be collaborating, working together. And as I said, I think that's something, it's wonderful to see this ecosystem thriving, also in the spirit of, the things that, Mrs. Stokes stood for, her convictions. We're all representing that through our work. So Khalila, John, any other final thoughts real quick?
I don't know. I think you all have
Nothing on my end.
sorry.
Oh, it's all good.
No, I just wanted to thank you all. This has been great. Thanks for everything.
Thank you all to all of our speakers. Y'all were so amazing. I could definitely keep listening to this. And thank you, Antoine, for guiding us through. I also just second, definitely check out PhillyCAM, whether you're watching or creating. Antoine gave us an amazing tour after the screening on Tuesday, and I'm setting up my own membership this week. I'm very excited about it. So I think everybody else should as well be an evangelist. And if you are interested in future programs that are inspired by the stories and legacies of folks who are buried at Laurel Hill, of which there are tens of thousands of amazing stories there, or anything related to death education. What's death education, you say? Well, check out our calendar. And we have virtual and in-person programs. So yeah, thank you again just to PhillyCAM for hosting this with us and everybody in the room. And we will have this recording available. If anyone here wants to share it, please just reach out. I'll give you my email. And that way you can access it if you want to share it with anyone. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have great evenings.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thanks.